For nearly 2 centuries, the United States has been an expansionist power. Though it was the War of 1812 when the U.S. solidified its dominion over the Americas, it was at the twilight of the Spanish-American War when the American Empire finally came of age. The first 2 decades of the 20th century marked America's transition, for better or worse, into a global superpower. After emerging from World War II as the world's dominant ascendancy, the U.S.'s sphere of influence would continue to expand its global network of military installations in order to curtail Soviet influence. Nearly 3 decades following the USSR's collapse, there are still 800 formal U.S. bases scattered across 80 countries worldwide. Not only is this unacceptable, but it's also needlessly wasteful. From 2001 to 2017, the total sum of money spent on bases in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan alone amounted to $880 billion. The utility of the empire's foreign military infrastructure is simply not worth the cost required to sustain it. Therefore, the number of bases worldwide should be strategically reduced to only those installations that are essential to defending the homeland and protecting international commerce. Although the USSR no longer threatens liberal hegemony, U.S. foreign policy is still rooted in a Cold War mindset. While an official plan for base realignment and closure was presented in the 1990s in the Clinton administration, few installations were actually ever shut down. Most were simply repurposed in order to deter other perceived threats to United States primacy. None of these installations do anything to help secure the homeland. They were designed to defend liberal hegemony, which is no longer the centralized bloc it once was. While American primacy made sense in the post-war era, there's no longer any practical need for the extent of its power to be as expansive as it is. Today, the single largest concentration of U.S. foreign bases is located within the Eurozone, where there exist unnumbered 350 military installations. Since 1942, the U.S. has maintained a permanent presence in Europe, and, after the Second World War, played a significant role in stabilizing the continent, which would go on to serve as the key focal point for NATO. Since then, the EU has become incredibly self-sufficient. The combined European armed forces, along with French nukes, are more than capable of deterring potential threats without the need for U.S. assistance. Every major European nation is wealthy enough to afford its own defense. Thus, it is strategically useless for the U.S. to maintain such a gargantuan military presence in the EU, whose members are already among America's closest allies. Having more military bases does not automatically create more deterrence. The U.S. currently has several dozen forward operating bases in the Middle East, hundreds of smaller outposts, and as of 2014, a combined garrison of 54,000 soldiers. If deterrence itself were a certainty, then a force of that magnitude would be able to ensure the stability of that region. More soldiers does not equate to more stability. More likely is it that there is a maximum threshold of marginal utility. There are 7 bases in Iraq. In a country that size, having 7 bases and 9,000 soldiers is no more effective than having only 3 bases and 3,000 soldiers. The U.S. Armed Forces possess a far greater technological advantage over other militaries as well. This means that fewer soldiers are thus required for an occupation to be successful. Regarding the defense of the homeland, a high-tech defense system would be more than enough to deter potential aggressors. Bases and outposts on islands throughout the Pacific, Arctic, and Atlantic Oceans would be the only foreign installations needed in order to supplement that. While the purpose of military occupation is to produce deterrence, such endeavors often have the exact opposite effect, in contrast to the intended result. It often makes a population more wary and resentful towards the occupying force. Attempts to exert hegemony have undermined the sovereignty of some countries, resulting in the rise of reactionary elements that oppose Western influence. The rise of ISIS, for example, was something that happened largely in response to the chaos that was left behind by the United States following its adventure in Iraq. Additionally, Russia expanded into Georgia and Ukraine, partially in retaliation to NATO's own incursion into what it viewed as its territory, and still does. As of 2020, the national debt sits at a whopping $22 trillion. The military budget accounts for roughly 17% of federal spending, and since 2016, over $600 billion has been spent every year on national defense alone, making it the largest of all discretionary budgets. Up to $120 billion of this is spent on the upkeep of foreign bases, and an additional $70 billion on contingency operations. Even if just half of all non-essential US bases were closed, the United States would save billions of dollars. This surplus could be allocated towards domestic spending or paying off the national debt. China currently owns most of the US debt, yet the US keeps borrowing money from Beijing every year just to maintain an unnecessary global troop presence. If America cannot afford to sustain its own military, then there is no reason that its military needs to be that large. Unrestrained militarism and high levels of deficit spending have contributed to the demise of countless great powers and empires throughout history. Having a military is important, but it is also important that the US only finance that which it can afford. This requires relegating spending to focus on funding only the essentials. The easiest way to start would be by closing foreign bases that are of no importance to national defense. A common concern among interventionists is that base closure will create power vacuums in unstable regions. This, they argue, leads to more violence and war, especially in the Middle East. A popular belief is that the military does not just deter US adversaries, but its allies as well. Without America to keep them in check, theoretically, nothing would stop Western-aligned authoritarian parties from taking over, violating human rights, and invading other countries. While closing bases in Europe would be an effective means of cutting spending, some argue against doing so, as these bases provide the US military with a quick and easy access to Eurasia in case we were ever needed to get involved for some reason. Geopolitical primacy is not necessarily a byproduct of military supremacy. In order to remain an influential superpower, all America need do is place a primary focus on the defense of her immediate sphere of influence, as well as securing economic interests in Asia. This would entail maintaining bases in countries like Japan and South Korea in order to deter countries like North Korea and China. Additionally, this would involve establishing naval imperium over the Strait of Malacca and restoring a central military presence of some sort to the Philippines. The extent of America's presence in the Middle East would pragmatically best be relegated to only a handful of bases in Djibouti, Kuwait, and the UAE in order to protect commerce and ultimately function as strategic staging locations in the case a serious conflict were to ever break out. Finally, the United States European Command's area of responsibility should be reduced to encompass only a fraction of its current size, both in relation to the number of US bases there are and the percentage of military personnel that are currently stationed all throughout the Eurozone. While it would be certainly foolish to close every single one of these foreign installations, the United States should not have any more soldiers stationed than are needed to sustain a pragmatically formidable presence. Areas of particular interest to the United States, as far as strategy is concerned, would be regions such as Greenland, Iceland, Turkey, and the Balkans. Other than that, there is little need to maintain such a vast network of military installations all around the world. Not only are a large number of these bases relics of a bygone era, they are also nothing more than a drain on resources and taxpayer dollars. To save the empire, it must be restrained. If America hopes to remain a superpower, she can no longer afford to cannibalize her own economy in the name of wanton imperialism. Military supremacy is inherently unsustainable in this day and age, and is an inadequate premise upon which to assert international hegemony. Therefore, America should instead predicate its empire on economic hegemony.